Hello, everyone. This is JT Keating, SVP of Product Strategy here at Simperium. I'd like to welcome you to another of Simperium's webinars. This one I'm very excited about. This one, I think we're going to have a lot of fun. The good news and bad news is that phishing is rampant at this point in time, and particularly mobile phishing. So we're gonna dive in. I'm going to give you the perfunctories. I'm going to make some introductions, and then we'll start rolling. The perfunctories. We like to try and keep these webinars to about 30 minutes worth of content, and then do Q&A at the end, and then get you on with the rest of your life. If there is no questions at the end, we don't make it up. We're not big believers in that whole thing. There'll be an archived version of this up on the website within a day or so, and we can make slides available to folks. We're also in the process of creating an infographic that's covering a lot of the same topics. So if you're interested in that, you can let us know as well. Please put any questions you have in the Q&A section of this. Don't use the chat part. We've had some difficulties with chat. So even if you have technical difficulties, please just toss that into the Q&A. So with that, part of the reason I'm really excited about this is not only the topic, because we're going to actually share some real research from what we've seen in 2020 around mobile phishing. And there was a huge increase in mobile phishing attacks, largely driven by some of the COVID related stuff, as you can possibly imagine. But the real reason I'm excited about it is that I'm doing this webinar with our VP of Security Research, Nico C. We were talking about the fact that I can't pronounce his last name, and apparently nobody can except him. But Nico, thanks for joining me.
Oh, JD, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here.
It's going to be fun. It's going to be a lot of fun. So let's dive in to this whole topic. Everybody's very familiar with some of the stats, for instance, from Verizon, particularly this stat. Consistently for the last 4 or 5 years, well over 90% of the breaches have started with some form of a phishing attack, some form of social engineering going after our employees. And if you think about it, I've been in security for a long time because I'm old. There's the single biggest risk in an organization has almost always been a carbon-based life form. It's been a human being. And phishing is predominant in that. So we're very familiar with this stat about, the 90%. What a lot of people might not be as familiar with is, and this stat is even higher now, this is a stat from 2018, is that 2/3 of emails are opened on mobile. And so since 2/3 of emails are open on mobile, the combination of mobile and security is a real risk. And we're going to make a couple comments as to how it's even more so than potentially on desktops in a couple minutes. But we're not going to go through all of these, but we do want to point out that mobile also makes things exceptionally easier for the bad guys, right? The bad guys, I mean, their gluosity, their greed, they're going to go after whatever endpoints happen to be available. And here's ones where the users are in charge. We just got finished talking about the fact that users make really bad decisions. There's tiny screens. There's no ability to compare things. We've got this thing where whenever we get something quick, we got to do it quickly, and we text when we're distracted. So there's all these different things form factor wise that make mobile a real issue. But then there's also new vectors that completely bypass existing solutions. First of which is personal email. Almost every person on their mobile device is reading their personal email. You can have corporate email, personal email. If you think about it, almost all of the protection for anti-phishing traditionally has been inline in corporate email. So anything outside of inline and corporate email is exposed. And so we're going to pivot here next, and we're going to actually get into the data. And Nico is going to run us through some of the data. But part of it is you got these new vectors. So I could get phished in my personal email, and because people have such a tendency to reuse credentials, immediately be used on my corporate side. Another huge one is SMS and messaging, which totally outside of corporate, and especially like in the COVID world, where all of a sudden things will be coming up about stimulus checks or about health checks or whatever. SMS and messaging. And then even though it's not really the topic for today, a lot of the malware that's out there, like BankBot, like BlackRock, they actually are forms of phishing from the standpoint of putting a template over a well-known brand of, let's say, a mobile banking app. People put in their credentials. So it's a form of phishing. All of these are outside of traditional protections. So with that, it's just kind of a setup, give everyone a little bit of a basis. We're actually going to dive into the data. And so to start off with, Nico, can you explain some of the thoughts on the trend line that we saw as the year progressed?
Sure. So as you know, and Simperior, we don't only focus on phishing, but we also focus on other types of attacks, network device malware, and it's we have basically the same trend in phishing and network attacks. So what we saw last year actually is that since mid-February, and that is something that we can correlate with the beginning of the pandemic in most of the countries and the lockdown, the number of network and phishing attacks started to grow a lot. And what we are showing here, it's basically the amount of threats that we are detecting every day. We can ignore actually the y-axis because the only thing that we want to show is the trend. And we can see that phishing attacks grew a lot. And the reason for this can be because working remotely doesn't necessarily mean working from home only. It means working from everywhere. So people started working on cafes or parks, libraries, or any other place in which you have open networks. And so that justified the rise of network attacks. And at the same time, the attack surface increases. So each time there is an increase in the attack surface, we see that attackers are actually taking advantage of that. So what we are showing here is exactly that. After COVID hit, the number of phishing attacks and network attacks grew a lot.
So Nico, anything from the spikes, like when you look at the spike in July, was there anything particularly newsworthy, anything that drove that that you can recall?
Oh yeah, actually that's a very good point. The spike in July was triggered by something that I was going to mention later on some of the stats that we have. It's related to a phishing campaign that was targeting Facebook. We found around few thousand domains were registered every day, targeting specifically Facebook. So that is actually what biased this chart a bit, or that what created that spike. But the rest is just a systematic growth distributed among all the brands that we see. It's not a specific campaign. So that means that phishing attacks grew as a whole, not as a targeted attack.
Got it. No, that makes a ton of sense. And then the next, logical question, there's a question that people always ask about, and it gets back again to human beings. And I'm not sure, kind of what commentary to make about this, but I think this is pretty fascinating.
Yes. So what we basically have two different types of threats. One of them is when a user is actually finding a phishing site, and then we also have a different threat that we use to know when the user actually opened the phishing site. So what we are showing here is the ratio between these two things. This literally means that even when the user is alerted about a phishing site, a third of them are going to open the website regardless of being warned. So to be fair, this doesn't necessarily mean that the attack is successful. Maybe the user is just curious and it's opening the website just to see what it's how a phishing site looks like. But there is also a big chance that some of them are completely ignoring the warnings.
Yeah, and for me, I take two things out of this. One, these are people that actually were warned and kept going. Then there's that whole group of people that don't have any protection in place at all, that pretty much all of them, or a huge chunk of them, probably went. We don't have that as a stat, but these are people that actually had some kind of protection in line that warned them about it. The other folks just went. And then to your point about the damage part, let's say somebody actually clicked on the link because they're curious, and they didn't maybe fall for it by giving up their credentials. They still could put themselves at risk, right? I mean, the website itself could deliver some form of malware, or like what are the risks of even accessing that site?
Well, malicious sites actually are wide set of forms actually. So for example, they can be opening a website that it's performing some type of cross-site scripting attack. So they are stealing credentials from other tabs. So yeah, what you're saying, it's perfectly, it's right actually. We should completely ignore websites that are malicious, or when we are warned about them, we should just close that and go to something else. But there are several risks. We can get malware, we can get cross-site scripting. I don't know, it's a different type of things can happen.
Right. I mean, you're just basically exposing yourself to increased risk by following through completely.
Yes.
So we're gonna in a few minutes, kind of get into like the domains and the brands and everything on those lines. But talk about what ZLabs. For those folks that aren't familiar, ZLabs is the name of the research arm. It's Imperium, and I can say this. Nico probably won't because he's humble, but I can say it because I'm actually not part of ZLabs. They are by far the best mobile threat researchers on the planet. These guys are wicked smart, including Nico. And one of the things that we discovered was a specific type of phishing attack that was using Google Forms. So Nico, can you just kind of explain how this whole thing kind of worked?
Yes, actually, this is very interesting because this type of phishing, specifically, it's really targeting the low-hanging fruits. And at the same time that we've seen this, we also found a huge sophistication in other types of attacks, which is something that we are going to talk later. So we have these two trends that are going in different directions. On one side, we have very sophisticated attacks, and then we have this, which is literally using Google Forms to target very well-known, actually, telco companies and email providers, just trying to trick users to enter their credentials in a Google form. It's crazy actually to think that people is falling for this, but given the amount of forms that we found, I mean, in the blog post we only reported 265, but this is something that we keep seeing. So this means that it's working. If we keep seeing that out there, it's because there are some users that are actually entering their credentials in a Google form and sending that to whomever created the form.
Right, and like you said, so kind of going with that theme of sophisticated and and kind of unsophisticated and some of the additional trends. Let's talk a little bit about the domains themselves. We got a couple slides on the domains before we get into the brands. What are some of the things that pop out at you in terms of the stats about the domains themselves and the nature of the domains?
Okay, so one of the things that we see is that phishing sites usually live for a very short period of time. There are some exceptions. We found some domains that are living for more than a year, and they are still active and still actually serving a phishing site, and they're not blocked by any hosting provider. But what we found is that on average, since the domain is created until someone detects that as a phishing, and here the reference that we are using is basically when the domains are added to any public phishing list, which is basically what a lot of vendors are using as a phishing protection mechanism. We have 26 days on average. So that means that for 26 days, we have what we can call in the malware or in the vulnerability terminology, a 0 day. Mm-hmm. So that means 26 days in which a phishing attack, in which that most of the time is an exact replica of the targeted brand website, is active and undetected. What we also seen is that once the website is detected, once the website is added to any public phishing list, they live on average 2 more days, and they are either taken down by the hosting provider or blocked somehow once maybe the attacker is taking the site down once they are seeing that, for example, Google is blocking that. So they react kind of fast, or they die kind of fast once they are known. Why is this important? Because most of the vendors are really using just lists. So they are just getting list of that someone else is reporting. Most of the time it's just humans. Someone realized that this specific PayPal site, it's really not PayPal domain. So I'm reporting that into one of these crowdsources phishing lists. And from that point onwards, everyone knows about that specific phishing link, sorry. But during 26 days on average, users are completely unprotected. And if we think again that some users are actually falling for Google Forms, if you have a very well created website, the chance for a user to actually be a victim of phishing is even higher. What I also mentioned in the previous slide was that we have this different trend in sophistication. One of the things that we saw is that the amount of phishing sites that are using encryption nowadays, it's growing a lot. So HTTPS traffic against HTTP. So last year we've seen a 20% increase since May. Actually, in May it was 44%, the number of phishing sites that were actually using encryption. And in November, that was 64%. But we also started to see other things. For example, we found phishing sites that are completely obfuscated, which is something that we've never seen before. Basically, attackers are getting the techniques that are used also to create malware. One of the things that basically malware creators do is they obfuscate the code so no one can actually understand it, or they have an extra layer for that. And we are starting to see that on phishing websites, which is something that it's never happened before. So we have these two phases, right? So before we were talking about very simple phishing sites, and the other side we have this very complex mechanism to create a phishing domain.
Yeah, I think I think the obfuscation part I think is fascinating. Kind of a self-defense mechanism. Do you think the HTTPS is, and it's probably a little bit of speculation potentially, but do you think the HTTPS is because it's all part of the ruse that some users are starting to get trained to look for HTTPS, or is there a different potential reason that you might explain that big spike of increase?
So encryption is a must nowadays, right? So each time we go to a website and we don't see the padlock saying that it's a secure domain, we kind of, we don't trust much. So what happened is that there are a lot of very simple tools nowadays, or it's very easy to encrypt a domain. So it's very little effort, the one you should add in order to create like a proper encrypted website. So we have now free certificates, like for example, Let's Encrypt. It's giving certificates for free, and they are really, really easy to use. So what happened actually is that before it was not that easy to encrypt a domain, to encrypt traffic, sorry, but now it is. So attackers, they need to go, it's not even an extra mile, it's just an extra step, and they have a site that looks way more legit.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. So one more comment about the hosting part and the domain part. You and I discussed this a little bit in terms of how fascinating this may or may not be to people. But I personally think it's amazing that a huge chunk of these sites are hosted in the United States. What should we read out of both between the United States and Panama, for instance? What are your thoughts about why so many of these sites, for instance, are hosted in the United States?
Okay, so we can maybe start with Panama, which is more interesting. Before you mentioned the spike in July, and I mentioned this campaign that was targeting Facebook, and all of those domains were hosted in Panama. So that's why Panama is in the second place here. So we have actually more than 10% of the domains were hosted in Panama. So we are adding to whatever usually is hosted there with this Facebook campaign. So that's why a country you wouldn't expect to see in this type of chart is there. And the US, the way to explain that is no other country has the amount of hosting providers than the US have. So if we normalize this chart based on the number of hosting providers that each country has, we will have a very different picture. And we will see the US wouldn't be anymore the first one. And it's not about controls. I mean, all hosting providers actually are trying to detect aggressively phishing domains, but it's not easy. It's really a hard problem. So they go through, most of them. And that's basically the reason why we have most of phishing domains hosted in the US.
Makes sense. Makes a ton of sense. So we talked about the users, third of them kind of doing their thing and going through, even if they've been warned. We talked about the Google Forms, and we started talking about some of the domain related stuff. Let's pivot now to stuff that a lot of people care about, and we're going to kind of finish going down this path, which is what brands, what categories, et cetera. So before we dive into the trees of the individual views with the brands themselves, let's talk about some of the categories. What jumps out at you, or if anything jumps out at you, on the categories of brands being phished?
So first of all, we need to consider something that you already mentioned before, that it's users tend to repeat passwords. So for an attacker, they are going to target every vertical market, or they were going to target as many services as they can, because if they get one password from you, since most of us currently have like 5 email accounts, 5 streaming services, 5 different social networks, not everyone is actually using a password manager or something like that. They are trying to remember the passwords, and most of them just decide to go with some very simple same password, adding some prefix in which sometimes is the actual name of the service we are using, or just repeating the password. So if I get access to any of your accounts, the first thing I will do as an attacker is I will go to your email and I will try the same password in your email. Once I have control of your email, I have control of all your accounts. It's just as easy as go and say, forgot the password, send me a recovery link, right? So that's one important thing to say. So attackers are going to target as many things as they can. But if we check the distribution, what we also can see here is the same bias as I mentioned before. Usually we don't see social network as the main vertical market targeted. What we usually see is the financial sector, which is in the first place. But since we had this Facebook campaign, that was actually switched. But usually it's a financial sector is a quick win, right? In the end, most attackers, what they want is to make some type of profit. And if I take control of your bank or your payment platform that you're using, I'm halfway there.
Right. Yeah. For me, you hit one question I had, which was, how much of an influence did the Facebook spike play on the social network side? But the other one that really jumps out at me is the productivity. And I know we're going to get into some regional differences that will show that. I think a lot of people underestimate the amount, since everything is pretty much on the web, everything's mobile now. That includes all the productivity apps, and especially with everybody working from home, and a direct path to be able to get to some of the corporate resources can be phishing, well-known productivity apps. We're going to dive into that. But the fact that productivity, for instance, is, double shopping on a phishing view, I think is pretty fascinating.
It is.
So,
but again, attackers will try to target as many services as they can, right? So, yeah, it's true what you're saying.
So here's, kind of towards the tail end of the year, I think this was as of November, if I remember correctly. This is the worldwide view. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about some geographic views, but anything particularly newsworthy here? Again, you got the Facebook spike, but then look at number 2. I think that's pretty interesting myself.
Yeah, so actually in Microsoft, we condensed productivity and email, right? So it's not only, so there we have Outlook as well. Mm-hmm. And then if we add all the financial thing like Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, then we adapt to that market pretty fast.
Right. So I think this is really interesting, but I think this is really interesting. So tell me just, some of the things that kind of pops out at you about this.
Well, yes. So what we were showing before, it's the global point of view, but that actually is changing a bit. If we zoom in some specific countries, we see that not every country actually is targeted with the same type of phishing. To be fair here, it's not straightforward to say that if something is hosted in the US, it's targeting actually someone in the US as well, right? So for example, if we check Brazil, for some reason, Brazil is a country in which we see a lot of phishing domains or phishing attacks. But we also see that someone registered in Brazil, for example, things as Bank of America or Chase. So what we are seeing here is where they are hosted. Of course, if someone is in Russia, we'll first try to host it's easier to host the domain in Russia to target Russians. So there is some correlation here, but it's not a one-on-one thing. But what is very interesting is that we can see the services that are most used in different countries just by filtering where phishing domains are hosted and checking the brands.
Yeah, no, I do think it's important. If I'm following what you're saying, we have our machine learning based detection that are actually on individual devices. Those mobile devices could be any place around the world because we're on tens of millions of endpoints around the world. This is actually where they're being hosted. This is not where they're being detected, right? In terms of being detected in terms of on individuals' phones, right? This is where they're being hosted. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
So we're gonna go through one last slide that's going to talk, which I think is important in terms of, and it's directly off of the point about the need for machine learning detection, similar, Nico, to what you were talking about in terms of the average life cycle of a site once it's detected, that it's up, it's down, so having a list and just relying on a list is not necessarily super helpful. You need to be able to detect things as they change. But while I'm looking at this particular site, folks that are actually online that are listening to this, Nico actually has what we call internally kind of the Oracle, and maybe not the most original name, but it'll work for us. And we can actually pull up the word map of the phishing sites for your countries. So we won't be able to hit a lot of people, but if you want to put a country of yours into the Q&A, once we do this last slide, then we'll actually pop over to the Oracle Live and we'll pull up one of those. So, but the last slide we've got, this shows geographic differences, as Nico was talking about. This is just an interesting view, and it actually happens to be from a quarterly business review that we were doing with some of our customers in the Nordics in particular. But on the left, it's May, on the right is November. And you can see the differences and the fact that things can actually change pretty dramatically as new campaigns come out. What are your thoughts on this, Nico?
For me, it's fascinating. This is a dynamic landscape, so we can zoom in geographically, and we'll see different how different countries are targeted with different attacks, and at the same time we can see also how they evolve in time. So for example, PayPal was very prevalent in May, and PayPal is very aggressive against phishing. So they are trying to detect phishing attacks very aggressively. So that actually you could notice from May to November. So it's amazing. It's fascinating to see and to be able to correlate this what we are actually seeing in the real world and the new solutions and new trends.
Yeah, and like you said, clearly right in the middle of these charts is July. And that comes back to your Facebook campaign out of Panama, which clearly changed the landscape, right? So excellent, interesting stuff. So I'm going to stop sharing and Nico can share his view. And we will see if we actually have some folks that are interested in their countries. Okay, so the first one that came up was Germany. There's somebody from one of our German visitors here are interested. So can you, Nico, give us a view of Germany?
Yep. So this is the brand map in Germany during the last year. So again, this is something that we can mention as well. It's not that all Facebook phishing domains are hosted in Panama, right? So we can see here that in Germany, we see a lot of phishing attacks as well.
All right, and then let's do one more in interest of time. Let's go to the other part of the world, Australia.
Okay, let's see Australia. A bit of different. So we have some specific brands. So Commonwealth Bank of Australia, Yeah, I'm not very familiar with businesses there, but yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I thought it was interesting when you went from Germany to Australia that Chase became #1.
Yes, it is.
So interesting, interesting. All right, well, we only have a few minutes left. We promised folks that we're going to, try and keep this to around 30 minutes, and that's exactly where we are. We actually have 2 questions so far that I can see. The first one is asking if we do takedown. We haven't done any takedown services out of ZLabs, have we? Site takedown.
So we cannot do that. We can report to hosting providers when we found phishing sites. For example, we work with Google to take down all those Google forms, and we keep doing that. We have a very good relationship with Google, so that's a very easy process. But if you want to take down individual phishing sites, you need to go and basically work with all hosting providers, and they are a lot. So we report them systematically, but it's not really up to us to take them down.
Perfect. And then one other question, and then we'll see if we have any more, and we're going to wrap up. Do phishing campaigns correspond to an increase in the Bitcoin price? Is there any correlation between Bitcoin and?
We see a lot of, actually, blockchain, it's targeted a lot. We see a lot of services. Actually, that is a very interesting question, and we haven't checked that correlation yet, but I will definitely do that.
Yeah,
my guess is that there will be something.
Yeah, I think so too. I definitely think so. Well, Nico, thank you so much. Definitely appreciate it. Thank you everybody for that's online for listening. Like I said, archive version will be up within a day. We'll be producing the infographic, and if you have any other questions at all, you can always contact us on our website, and we'll be happy to get back to you. So thank you everybody. Thank you, Nico, and everyone have a great day.
Thanks, JD. Have a good one.